Hey man,
Joe, what's happening?
how are you?
Never better. I'm glad we got this figured out.
Yeah,
And Microsoft doesn't like my emails.
I'm gonna have to figure that out. I've never in my entire life been texting with a friend who we both claim we're emailing each other, and neither of us can figure that out. So there's some irony here that we're both having run small tech companies and things like that. So anyway,
Yeah, who would think? I was like, why didn't Joe get back to me? And then I didn't think about it. But hey, I'm glad we worked it out. Thanks for coming on the show. I was trying to think about you and I caught up last week, and you haven't been on the show. And I was like, oh, I think it's been 20 years since when you started your first consulting company in Baltimore. Hadn't it been that long?
it's probably been 18 to 20. I think it's fair. We'll just call it. We'll round up.
I mean, that sort of makes us
Young
old, but
guys.
yeah, but and since then, and then I left Baltimore probably 15 years ago, or Maryland more so, and I think in that time you built a big consulting company around organization restructuring, I guess would be the right word. You can correct me. You did a New York Times bestseller. You've given more TED Talks than I know that have
Wow.
hundreds of thousands of views because I watched them. Watched one the other day, and now you're on to doing a tech company. So you've been quite busy.
Yeah.
Did,
Kind.
did I sum that up correctly?
Yeah, I think you nailed all the pertinent points. I think the last 20 some years for me has been, both a personal development journey of, working out, who I want to be in this world and how I want to leave the world in one way, shape, or another. And I think the second piece is really using business as a force for good in every possible way I can. So whether it's taking care of our team in a great way or our customers or I've been an investor too and a GP in a small VC firm that invests in female diverse founders in Baltimore called the Conscious Venture Lab and Partners, which I'm super proud of too. And so it's been an amazing life and journey. So it's been great to reconnect with you, my man.
The your consulting firm. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I, I think people do consulting, but you really went into it with organizational change, and you actually did have a big impact on some Fortune 500, Fortune 5,000 companies in that journey. And I know you're still doing it, but can you talk a little bit about that and what you've seen in organizations? Because everyone listening is either part of an organization or building an organization and probably would want some tips from a guy who's like 5x people's revenue. And that's not going from 100,000 to 500,000. That's in some cases going from a billion to five,
Yeah.
which is extremely hard to turn a ship around.
Yeah. So not to give too much history, but when I was in college, I was a bit of a fish out of water, needing to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And I went to Hopkins. And before Hopkins, for 10 seconds, I went to a high school in Baltimore that had a 23% graduation rate.
Yeah,
So,
that's Patterson for those listening, because I went to
yeah.
school in Baltimore at another school that used to play Patterson for sports all the time.
Yeah. So, all that just to say, I, worked my whole life. I was a hustler and entrepreneur, kind of on the streets of Baltimore. And when I got to Hopkins, um, I quickly understood I was not going to be an engineer or a doctor or go to Wall Street. And I actually got a job with Anderson Consulting when I left. And, I was parlaying basically some experience I had in running a general contracting company that I took from 5 people to 150 by the time I was 22. And so I basically applied a lot of blue collar things I learned in sports, things I learned from my dad and my great parents that sort of raised me. And when I, sort of started to like feel out this Anderson consulting thing, what I started to feel like was, one, I didn't fit in. I wasn't going to be a guy programming in C and, basically creating decks all day. But B, I saw that, a lot of the things that I think we sort of think about in companies, it's like keeping your hands clean, not getting your hands dirty. And so what I saw was an opportunity to, bring into the sort of space of companies and business sort of three things. One, a little bit of personal development, that life's short. We're not going to be here long. And, when you think about someone bringing them their whole selves to work. It was right around the time that emotional intelligence was even like a topic, right? Danny Goleman writes this book in the mid 90s off the work of Martin Seligman around the positive psychology movement. Most people don't know this, but we're like less than 100 years in to studying what works as opposed to what doesn't work around the human psyche. And I think that's an important piece. But the second piece is that change is hard. Everybody sort of talks like, oh, it's great. We're going to go take this hill. We're going to go build this business and we're going to do whatever. But people don't understand that it is like, it's one thing to talk about it from the stands or to be a spectator. And I think a lot of consultants that I had seen and been exposed to, I just didn't want to be someone who didn't actually do it. Like we wanted to build a business while we were helping other people build a business. I didn't just want to write books and be like a pundit from the stands. And so that was the other piece that I thought that we brought to bear. In the last, from a consulting standpoint, mostly it's long-term contracts. You send a SWAT team of 35 people in full time to go sit and do stuff. And I just thought, like, what would I have wanted? I would have wanted a partner, a handshake, someone who delivered, someone who said, this is what we're going to do. And they did it. And then when they didn't, they apologized. They didn't let the little things get in the way of the big things. And when they messed up, they said they were sorry. And we forgave each other quick and we just kept working the plan. And so for the last 20 years, to your point, what we've been doing is, as a boutique management consulting firm, is helping people, as I wrote my first book, grow regardless of your size, your industry, frankly, the economy, and certainly despite the government.
I'm curious, you definitively said that you went to Hopkins and that you knew that you weren't going to be a doctor, an engineer, or something else. I find it ironic that you now have a software company, but we'll talk about that in a minute. What made you say that with such certainty, or know that with such certainty? Because that school is fundamentally designed around medical things in general. It's known for that. It has business and it has these other things, but that's what it is. And then you wind up there and you decide that you're not that.
So I said it, and I'll say it a different way, which is, I grew up in an environment that could be most accurately described by the HBO show The Wire. And
It
so,
was The Wire. I think maybe there were some shots from The Wire in your
yeah, I mean,
backyard.
violence, guns, drugs, police, broken homes, a part of society and the world that a lot of people are not so familiar with. So the range of experience that I had coming into Hopkins was pretty wide. But, academically, I have been doing this most of my life, which is I'm able to sort of take a quantum leap because the world, the universe has sort of allowed that to be. And so getting into Hopkins was a big deal when you had a guy who only had 1,000 on my SATs after taking it 5 times. And when I got there, I quickly found out that I was, a little like I'm always, I'm a quick learner. I'm someone who can pick up on things quickly, but I had not read a book front to back. I had not written a paper. I had not done the things that you need to do to get into a school like that. And so when I got there, I took organic chemistry for a day and I was like, this is not happening. And then I bounced around and took a econ major with almost a minor in psych, which, given kind of what I do, those things made sense to me. And I think culturally, Brandon, you kind of just know sometimes where you fit. And, as much as a poor kid who wanted to go like find a way that I didn't ever have to look at an empty refrigerator again, look, I would have shoveled shit if you told me that that was what I had to do. But I think what Hopkins did is it opened up an array of opportunity. And I have kind of always been a little bit of an outsider. So while everyone was doing the prescribed path to Wall Street or the prescribed path to management consulting at a big firm, some of it is the imposter syndrome, as I didn't think I was going to last long. Some of it is I don't like to be told what to do. And the last is, look, I've met some really incredible, successful people. And as my dad would say, they put on their pants just like we all do every single day. And I think as much imposter syndrome and insecurity that I have, which I have a lot, I also have a lot of trust in myself that I would rather trust me than someone else. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's when
it's
it's
a good answer, and to be fair, I'm completely setting you up because we're going to talk about psilocybin therapy and how that opens up all this. But I'm always interested to know, and these things. I think you're right. I think our gut sometimes says, "Hey, I'm probably not going to fit." I mean, I thought I was going to be a lawyer, but looking back on it, Joe, I think I just told people that in college because if you tell people that, people get off your case because it's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, of course that makes sense. You're going to do that," and it worked. The scary part is it kept working so good that when I graduated, I couldn't figure out what the hell I was going to do. But um, that's what happens. And then later in life, you sort of go through this. Going back to your organizational stuff, though, what do you think you found in all of that work? And I know you wrote a book on it, and we'll put the link in the show notes and everything like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, what does make the change to grow regardless? What is if I said, "Hey Joe, you only get to tell me one thing today, and I'm going to actually do it. So be careful what you tell me to do because I'm going to really do it." What are you going to tell me to do?
I think the thing that I would tell you to do is we all have a blind spot, many of them. And if you're at the top of the organization, it's shaped like a pyramid. And that pyramid, there's a quote from Churchill. He said, "We shape buildings and then they shape us." Meaning, we're all sitting in this hierarchy which embeds an adult to child relationship in every organization, which is sort of a funny thing when you think about a grown adult that has to clock in or has to check in or has to show up at a certain time and has to, when we look at the way that we treat people, we treat them like children. And so they act like children. Now, there's a call to action here. From a leadership perspective, just be mindful of this blind spot that there a lot of times is an adult to child relationship that presents itself as, I can't keep my people, I can't get them engaged, we set a goal and we didn't hit it. But the root of this is that if you meet people shoulder to shoulder, you invite them into a conversation. Look, I believe that everyone is doing the best they can, but sometimes the best isn't good enough. So this isn't about we're all in it together no matter what. This is how do you speak with people regardless of their job title, regardless of, bank tellers see more customers than any other position in the company, paid the least, treated the worst. Flight attendants, customer service reps. I mean, we go over and over and over through all these different business models where if you just asked people, why do you work here? Why do you care about this? Why does it matter? And then my favorite last question is, what will make today worth it? That's how you talk to adults. You kind of give them their sovereignty. You give them the ability to have a voice and a vote. Now, you may not like either of those two things, and that's fine. But at least you know what they're thinking. That would be what I would tell you.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I wonder why, and maybe it's just human nature, Joe, that especially founders who grow companies bigger, and I'm not in my early career, I think I tried not to do it, but I think it can happen, is you get this sense of accomplishment, and that accomplishment is reinforced by you being the boss and getting status. And I mean, we see it every day. I mean, politicians don't get paid a lot, although I wonder sometimes how they have these $10 million houses. Probably a conversation for another time, Joe. But um, they, in theory, don't get paid a lot, but they trade on status. It is all about status. It's about fame. It's about who gets quoted in these things, and that is not this. That currency is different in business because if you don't have customers, it really doesn't matter. But we lose sight of that, and I wonder why, and I'm sure you've heard it, and I've heard it, that leaders will say they want to know about leadership and all this. I don't know. This leadership word really bothers me, Joe, which I'll ask you about in a second. But leadership doesn't seem that hard to me. Leadership is pretty simple. I think you broke it down to get down, go down to where the people who touch your customers are, ask them regular questions, And just doing that, you will be leading because those people will see that you care. There's like all these leadership books. I mean, can you comment on this? Because I go off on a tangent on this. Like, we're going to teach leadership. Just, it doesn't seem complicated to me, to be honest with you. It really just says treat people how you want to be treated and don't get at the top of this pyramid and stay there, like walk down the steps and go to the bottom on a daily basis. And I'll tell a story and then I'll let you take over. Because I know you were in construction in the early days, right? Yeah. So had a bigger construction. Was involved in a construction project that we oversaw. We didn't we managed the bond. And there's some senior leaders at a company that I won't name, and the trailer is on site. The trailer is on site. Let me say this one more time. The trailer is on site. The buildings are not even a football field away. I mean, if part of the building's 100 feet away, then Joe, I'll buy you dinner. Like, that's how close this is. Okay. And I used to walk the building. I don't claim to know a lot about construction. I mean, if there's a plug between the wall, a glass wall, and a piling that you can't reach to, I don't need a degree to figure out that that's a problem. Okay. Like, I can see that by just putting on my boots and walking the site. So we would have these meetings with the senior manager. He was manager of the whole construction company. And we would ask these questions like, well, why isn't this done? Well, what do you mean it's not done? Well, I don't know. I just put on my boots, walked into the building and asked the person with the hammer or whatever the tool is, hey, what's going on? And they just tell me everything because they're there every day building the building. And this person would get from their car. I'm not going to even say their car because might give it away for some listeners. They get in their car, which, by the way, Joe, there is a specific spot for this car right in front of the steps to the trailer. This is real. This is a real story. And they would walk from that trailer to that car every day, but never put on their boots. And and then they would act shocked. Well, what do you mean that this isn't happening? No, it's not happening. I don't need a piece of paper. I don't need 3 managers to tell me. And I really don't care what your look ahead says. I walked the building. There's no cement in that hole. Without the cement in the hole, we can't build on top of it.
Right.
Your spreadsheet may say something different. So I'm using this example, and that person and that team would sometimes ask the partner that I worked with in that company, like, what could we do better? And I would just sit there shaking my head, like, put on your boots, stop wearing sneakers, and do that. And that's what leadership isn't, but should be. And I'm not saying I was leading. I was just getting down and getting out of the office to basically see what's happening. And I think people who lead companies forget about that.
It's a great story, and one that is almost as old as time, which is, Voltaire said common sense practices or principles are not so common. And I think in a lot of respects, and I hit this in my TEDx talk, which was legacy thinking. And I'll drop down even further, which is it's a cognitive bias. That bias is a pattern in your brain of what is reality, what is happening right now. We are always referring back to past experiences. And that's the way our biology runs. We're looking for, does this remind me of something in the past? The way AI actually does the exact same thing these days. And what sometimes is hard to break from the gravity of that status quo is to pick something different. Because we got to remember, the wiring is, if something's different, it could be trouble, could be a problem, it could be a threat. And I think in a lot of ways, we have not divorced ourselves of this long history of tyranny, this long history of empire building, this long history of trauma, of how was it done to me? Like, as a parent, the best I'm doing is a little bit better than what was done with my parents. And it's really hard, I think, to have, look, there's definitely some folks that we should have zero compassion for, zero empathy for in terms of the abuse of power. And Donald Trump was probably the greatest example of what does it look like to have shit that you have not dealt with yet. And regardless of his policies, his vision, his all of the other stuff, his behavior, as clear as day from a leadership perspective of someone who, when you've heard the line, hurt people, hurt people. And so, again, I could have picked anyone out. He just was an easy target for me. And I think, again, whether you like him or not, you can't help but look at his behavior and say, the reason actually you said fame, the fame game, it's this pursuit of an external thing to give me an internal feeling. That's what the fame game. It's like saccharin. It's like stevia. It's not the real stuff, right? And then on the other side, the shame game. The shame game is let me knock you down because I'm empty. It's not hitting. So I've got to protect my position, my place. I've got to make myself taller by making you smaller. And that narrative from a leadership perspective, going all the way back to like the Don Draper days of corporate America, where, guys in particular, we have a shitty version of what it means to be a man. And we need a update. Women have gone through all these different evolutionary steps of like, getting better and being more and finding whatever their unique song is in this whole symphony that we're living. And, I think about, you had mentioned this idea of when a musician starts playing, generally, not all the time, they play other people's music. They're a cover band until they find their own song. And I think in kind of a philosophical way, we're all in search of that song. And I think it's a little scary because if I'm going to try something, to your point, it seems common sense to you. My experience over doing this for 20 some years, 600 plus organizations we've worked with, literally tens of thousands of leaders, you're in the 5 to 10% of minority that we would meet. And people go, what the fuck are we? Why is this like, what are we like? You got to tell me how to do what? Like to go walk around and talk to people like a normal, like you would almost be insulted. Right. And
I'm
that's,
laughing because it's so it like it's so dumb, Joe.
it is. And to me, it's a huge opportunity because we're not talking about groundbreaking change here. We're talking about little small step changes, which is why we've been pretty good at this. Yes, the results are sometimes quantum leaps, but the actual things we did to like unlock, unblock, or just fix the bottlenecks, which are sometimes these relationship dynamics where people go, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You haven't heard from me that I appreciate your value. And if I did that, there would be some discretionary effort that you would give more than what you're giving today. Or how about another frame? When you babysit a kid, they're not your kid. You're only going to go so far. You're not sitting in the middle of traffic for that kid. Think about that in terms of business. If people take ownership, there's nothing stopping them. You don't need a SOP for someone who takes ownership of an outcome, but we focus on the presenting issues, which is, we basically teach, and we know this, to the C student. Someone broke the rules. This is why we can't have nice things. And then we have a rule for that one time it happened. And when you look at most high performers in organizations, they do it despite all of those things. They're just successful because some of it's innate, some of it is developed, and some of it is learned through watching others. And that's where we focus, is that sort of A minus, B plus, B player. Because if they can just see what the A's are doing, you just get out of the way. And you'd be surprised what happens.
Do you think that there's this phenomenon of, and how do you stop it? I'm going to guess you're going to say yes to this, but maybe you won't. Is that you really only should be hiring A players, and the minute that you are insecure or you're not willing to hire someone smarter than you is the minute your organization is destined for death, because it might not happen at 10 people, it might not happen at 20, it might not happen at 50, but eventually it's going to happen that The B players in general are going to be more insecure. And you already said this. So for listeners, I'm not, most humans are insecure in some level. It's
Yeah.
your insecurity only gets better by acknowledging it
Right.
and running at it. So
Right.
let's just say that for listeners. So you won't get blasted, but I will. Um, is they will hire C players, and the C players are even worse, and they will hire the D players, and then you're just hiring mediocre people who then protect their jobs, which becomes toxic, and it only reinforces the A player staying at the top being reported to because now they feel like they've got this fiefdom or kingdom or cult, whatever they built, company is another word for it, underneath of them. And then it becomes a real mess. So have you seen that? And how do you only hire A players?
So, a little footnote to my experience is that I ran a recruiting firm for about 12 years. And so we thought, instead of farming all this work out, right, we'd go in and do, hey, Brandon, you're the CEO. Where do you want to go? You'd say, I want to go right instead of left. I want to go up instead of down. I want to achieve some big mountain climb. Great. So we take a look and we would come to the same conclusion. You've got some A's, you've got some B's, you've got some C's, right? So whether it was top grading or whether it was neutron jack, get rid of your bottom 10%, whatever the frame was, I think everybody's on board with that mostly. I think where it gets tricky is how are we measuring performance? How are we measuring productivity? And when you look at people from a recruiting standpoint, I will tell you, we would test them. We would make sure they had a soft landing and a great onboarding experience. And still, 50 to 60% of the time, you can't call it one way or the other because you'd look at someone's past experience and say, well, that adds up to this new piece. But what we sometimes forget, the fundamental attribution error, which is that we attach a reason, a cause, an ingredient, a factor, and create a formula for why we think this person's going to work. And I think the piece that we miss the most isn't can they do the job, but will they? Are they thirsty? Are they hungry in this new chapter? Because I can tell you, we've had people who were amazing. I've hired amazing people at Shift, people you and I both know who have come into the organization. I mean, one guy helped take the company from not us, but his previous company, 5 to 50 million. Then we brought him in, and no disrespect to him, he was trying to herd Tweedledee and Tweedledum, me and the other guy running the
I
company.
remember this, but keep going.
Yeah, and again, I wouldn't knock him for not taking us to whatever that next level was. That was really on me from a business development standpoint. But I will tell you, it didn't kind of feel the best all the time, and not because he wasn't great, but he was at a different place contextually. And I think that's what I would try to sort of maybe convey to anybody hearing this, which is one, you're only going to have about a 50 to 75% on a great day hit rate on people that you bring into the organization. So recalibrate just the front end hit rate, number one. Number two, things change constantly. So whatever formula you used to get them into the organization, that was going to be the reasons why you have to keep going all the way back to the land of zero. It's like, not what have they done, but what does the job need? And again, depending on the role and depending on the situation, you may have to really ask some deeper questions about, can they do the job and will they do the job? The can they, you can test, you can train, you can mentor, you can guide. The will they, no, that one's a little bit more like, are they ready to do the best work of their life? Do they see that their best days are ahead, not behind them? Are they in a growth mindset, which is really what we're talking about? Carol Dweck's book, growth mindset, is back to the idea that I'm not fixed in the past. The past does not equal the future. I'm more creating, exploring, making things happen that are different. It's almost like when you talk to someone who's quit smoking. Well, how do they quit? Most people that quit smoking, right? The New Year's resolution that everyone sets every single year, we've got the gum, we've got the patch, we've got hypnosis, we've got all this crap. And I've been talking to the people about this all the time. And I'm like, hey, how did you quit smoking? And most people who've quit say this: I just did. Well, how did you do it? I just did. There's a story behind why. And they chose a different path. They chose not that the past equals the future. They just said, this is the way it's going to be. That is a muscle. And they've written books about habits. Atomic Habits is a decent book. I think the one before that, which is really what the book I think stemmed from, which was a book called Power of Habit. You and I were jamming on this before. There's a process to develop a habit, but there's still an intrinsic motivator behind all of that, which is Simon Sinek's, why do you want to do this? What makes it worth it? It's your life. Talk to people like, this is your life force. You're only going to be here once. What are we going to do here? And I think having these kinds of conversations, generally speaking, we have found to be really helpful because, look, I don't think any of us want to be a bad guy and like fire people and send them out. But there have been 10 million open positions for the last 5 to 6 years. There's plenty of positions for people. We're not putting anybody out of work. It's not the Great Depression. So for now, you're being a good human and maybe letting them fly a little higher somewhere else. And I think that's another piece that gets down to this trauma, which is like, I'm a shitty boss sometimes. I over empathize. How's that for giving myself a pat on the back and a gold star? What do you mean? Like, you care too much? Yeah, sometimes I do. Sometimes I project my own shit on other people when it's our company. And then it gets me in this like weird situation where I pick loyalty over performance 90% of the time because I trust people. And we bring people in that have good hearts. And then sometimes it works most of the time. And a lot of times, or not a lot, but sometimes it doesn't. And I just have to deal with the tax on the doesn't part. And that's the way that we've run the business. And again, I'm not claiming you should be listening to any of this. This is just the way it's happened and unfolded for us.
So getting back to it, is there a way or structure that you put into place to make sure that the A players stay A players? Because if you can do that, you get a winning organization. I mean, there'll be mistakes and there'll be bumps in the road and there'll be some egos and there'll be human nature stuff. That's You're not going to weed that out. But you will have a group of incredible people, and incredible people generally do well, even if they compete against one another. Sports teams are a prime example of that. When a star can put themselves not in front and not go one on one all the time, a bunch of stars can play with one another and they win.
Right.
I mean, the Warriors are a team of an example of that. I'll argue that even though the Lakers lost, you look at LeBron James, he put himself, yes, he still scored 40 points, but he put his other people in a place to play. Jimmy Butler, if there's anybody, right now in the Miami Heat with 4 undrafted people, I mean, incredible. Like, that's leadership. He didn't even do anything magical. He's letting himself not be the star and letting these other A players who are clearly A players be A players.
Right.
So can you manufacture that?
Well, maybe ask a different question. It's go back to what you just said, which is, can you create it? Because I think manufacturing has a different feel for me when I hear that. I think, look at those coaches. What was the vision? Like, were they looking to win a game, get to the playoffs, get to the championship, or a dynasty? Right. And I think being very credible as a leader, sort of establishing the vision. Like, you and I have a mutual friend, Brian Leggett. I remember when he got out of one of his companies, he's like, I'm going to go clean bedpans in Haiti. I'm going to go, I can't remember the second thing, but the
I'm
third.
laughing because for listeners, Brian started a company called One A's. It was super successful, one piece earmuff company, but
Yeah.
he's such a good human. But it's just funny because I'm listening to him and I'm listening to you, but seeing him do this, and it's just funny, right? But go ahead.
But he's like, hey, do you want to go climb Kilimanjaro? And I've never been camping. I'm a 30-year-old guy. I've never camped. Been in the city, my whole city mouse. Like, I had no idea what this whole thing looked like. So I was like, Brian's going, I'm going. Now, the reason I'm saying this is that he didn't say, let's go to Everest. 10,000 people go to Kilimanjaro every year. Not everybody makes it up, but it's not the Everest hit rate. And this, to me, is one of the most important parts, which is like, what is the game we're playing? How do we win this game, so to speak? And I think getting back to your vision piece, I think if you can establish, I know everybody says it, but if you can really establish a clear journey and destination, and the best way I do this, which is like describe an ideal day. What does an ideal day look like when we get there? What does an ideal day look like as we're getting there? I think that's the first piece. And the second piece is, I think, the Charlie Munger, show me the incentive structure and I'll show you the outcome. It's not about just money, just equity. It's, to me, about the whole package. So, before it was cool to remote work, we had been doing this adult to adult, come and go as you please. You need to do a dentist appointment. You need to grab your kids for a baseball game. Like, live your life. The rest of this, we'll figure it out. I trust you as an adult. You're going to find a way to get your work done and to be a whole person. And I think, the last piece I would say around this is that, back to being credible, is that they have to see it being done. So it's not like they want my life or your life, but there's got to be something that says, I am still growing. Like, I am not even close to, not just like the best version of myself, but someone that isn't constantly trying to assimilate new information or isn't constantly looking for a better way to work, to run the play, to live life, to be a good ancestor. Like, those are the things that I think when you look at a lot of great leaders, they have built themselves into this to some degree. Some of them were born like this. Some of them were taught like this. Some of them have become this. And I think there's a magnetism that we all kind of go like a moth to the flame of, like, we kind of hang out with the people that we want to be like. Right. And so it's not like, again, for the wrong reasons, but I do think, one of my mentors used to say this. He used to say, it's better to be an example than an explanation. That's it.
Yeah, I think people just follow it. And being there's so many leadership books, Joe. Like, I think after so many years, you're like, did we write enough about it? Like, I wonder if you distilled that into you took all the leadership books and you did a meta-analysis like you do a scientific study, what would come out of it? I mean, would it be as simple as, hey, just do what you want your people to do? Right? Like, be the example. They'll follow you. You'll be successful. Not everybody, but most people. And pick the people who do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last time I saw a stat is, I think there's about 30,000 books written every year on the topic of business, leadership, psychology, self-help, etc. Right? So, in one hand, we got a lot of people who got a lot to say, right? On the other hand, if you think about, again, this is just my point of view, but we sit in school and we're talked at. We're programmed, we're conditioned. I said this in my TEDx talk. I said, school bells. Do you know we're still using school bells? Do you know where this came from? Dr. Pavlov, the dog, the bell. They applied that thinking to the factory floor and it worked. And then they just said, let's extend that to the school. We've been doing that for 100 years, right? Like, we're typing on an ass backwards keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard, 1860 was when this thing was invented. We all had to take typing because we all were typing so fast when it said A through Z, because we were familiar with the patterns of the keys, that the guy who invented the keyboard was like, fuck, I got to figure this out. So 7 years took him to come up with the configuration of the QWERTY keyboard. Like, there are all these things that are built on these layers and assumptions that like your phone does 13, 15 software updates when there's a bug, right? We as humans don't do that part so well in terms of updates. And I think that's important because context matters. Like, go back to an amazing book for people who want to learn more about organizational development and change. By far, if you go to Harvard, they'll talk about The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. Interesting book, but not really that my cup of tea. Another book called Reinventing Organizations by a guy named Frederick Laloux. He was an ex-McKinsey guy, self-published this thing, and basically said, look, you got to think about business mirrors society and society mirrors business. So back in the day, we would have leaders that were a little more autocratic. big surprise because that was the flavor of the day. And then you fast forward in the 80s and 90s, people started talking about like foosball tables, taking care of people, follow your passion. And then we got Tony Hsieh from Zappos, who turned a call center into $1 billion transaction with Amazon with one SKU by just trusting his customers and employees. And you can start to see, don't get, it doesn't have political about ESG and CSR, but what you do see is people widening their circle of concern and attempting to figure out, how do we create a little less harm? And I'm granting a lot of good faith here, not suggesting that that's always the case. And so I think that's getting back to your topic about leadership. So I'm writing a third book, Laugh at Me Now. And the opening line is, this book is for everyone who's tired of reading business advice books. This is a book not about giving advice. This is like, we got to stop playing someone else's song. We got to figure out what works, because you and I are unique. There isn't a way to do it. There's several. And I think that's something that doesn't get enough airtime, which is like, if you want to get healthy, sure, go to CrossFit, ride a bike, fast, sleep, read a few books. I mean, there's so many ways to do it versus this reductive, put my hands on the bridge and go, this is the way. This isn't the Mandalorian. There are plenty of ways to get there. And I think that's part of what we're struggling with a little bit, which is the internet has given us so much information, Brandon. Our brains are not able to do anything but mindlessly skim, scan, and scroll right now. They're calling it TikTok brain for a reason, because we're sedating and numbing versus, I think, kind of putting ourselves to the test and figuring out what we're capable of and running towards adversity, not away, because, again, of things that we just haven't dealt with yet. No. Anyway,
I think that I'd be interested in your book, because I agree with you 100%. And I talk about when I do an experiment, like I ate vegetables, I think, for 2 or 3 weeks straight, and like figured out what that looked like. I did CBD to see if CBD like changed my sleep. I've done, I mean, these aren't scientific, but they are measured. I did a sauna experiment. I did this experiment with L-theanine, caffeine, and creatine. It works for me. And I always say, you need to experiment on yourselves. But you need to experiment on yourself, and you need to monitor yourself. Like, I cannot eat avocados without gaining weight,
Right.
even when I'm net negative on calories every day. I don't know why that is. And somebody out there, whatever Lane or whoever it will be, Huberman will say, well, that's BS. And I'm telling you that that's what happens to me. It's just the way that my body's a little bit different, processes things a little bit different. For you, you might be able to eat 5 avocados, and good for you, because I like them and I can't eat them. But you've got to be willing to experiment. And I think, I don't know how you're going to address it in the book, but people don't want that. I don't want to say they don't want it. I don't know, Joe, that people have time. Now, let me say, they do have time, but they don't think they have time, which means that's their reality. They don't have time, because they're, this morning, maybe even listening to this on the way to work or doing something else, they had to put 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in a lunchbox with a Capri Sun and a bag of Doritos and maybe a Whoopie Pie or a Twinkie or whatever kids eat these days, and get kids out the door, get to work, whether that's even at home, and figure out what's going on. So when you say, hey, you need to experiment on yourself, they're like, Joe, experiment on myself? Like, yeah, there's a lot of ways to do it. Will you just tell me which way to do it? And I will do it that way. So it's almost like the people who have time have to figure out a method that is versatile to be able to do it, because people, they don't have the time. Or, you said this earlier, I think you said it several times, this stuff's hard.
Yeah, well, and what I think sometimes we forget is the struggle we all play with just to be comfortable. Like, think about how much you work hard to avoid problems. It's an interesting thing to think about. Like, I catch
I'm
myself all
laughing
the time.
because it's true. It's
The guy who,
avoidance is a great, great drug.
well, and worry. like I'm someone again who grew up around a lot of guns and violence, and remember the 1% doctrine from our boy Dick Cheney, back in the day. And he said, if there's a 1% chance, we got to go to war. And I would just say that having come from hard environment, that's how I made it out. Like I had to do the calculus, the math. If there was a 1% chance to get caught here, I would have to figure that out. Right. And I sometimes notice in business how much time I spend worrying about things that have not yet happened. Right. I will stress about the stress. I will think through the 72 ways this could go wrong, and then my parachute for what I'll do when. And I've recently kind of caught myself to think about, well, what does success look like? And getting back to your point about why don't we do these things? I think, again, programming, conditioning, not having a better story. And we're living in like an amazing time right now. In the last 45 years, more changes happened to human beings than the previous, I think, 10,000 human being lives. One cycle. Us in the age range that we are have just experienced more change than most. So let's give ourselves a little bit of grace. Let's start there. Number two, your point about the data is interesting. And it's a funny story that you mentioned quickly. 7, 8 years ago, I decided to get a food sensitivity test, a toxicity test, a DNA test, a blood panel, inflammation markers, the whole workup. I lined up all the tests, 7 or 8 of them, and we shot an arrow down the middle and said, okay, guess what? For me, N of 1, I can't have chicken or avocados. Now, there's not a book on the planet, and I know a lot of them around longevity and performance and the whole thing that would have said, that's a good idea. That plus a few other little things that I did, I lost 35 pounds in about 4 or 5 months. And again, what's interesting is not only is it an N of 1, but it changes. Like now I can have chicken. Now I can have avocado. Like whatever's creating inflammation. We just are learning about this. 100 years ago, we didn't know what physical standards of health looked like. Remember the guys with the handlebar mustache and the leotard leopard thingy that they had? We were just starting that. We just found out the food pyramid was wrong. We just found out that fat is good for us. We now know we have fMRI brains of like what actually is going on in here. Like we're just getting some of this. So when we look at the law of distribution, the sort of adoption curve, you and I are on the bleeding edge. And we got some folks who are still trying to figure out how the internet works, right? And that's okay. Like, because there's also, to me, I'm not better than anyone else. I just have a unique set of experiences. You have a unique set of experiences. I think we all can learn something from each other. I think we all are going through things that none of us know about. And I think that extension of grace creates space to have better conversations with the people that you work with. And look, if we have learned anything since 2016, back to the political side of this, is that you can't change someone's mind. That's not the way it works. There are some of us that are more susceptible than others. There's a great book on this by a guy named Dan Ariely. He wrote a book called Predictably Irrational, but his second book, The Honesty About Dishonesty, was my favorite. Now, he's gotten a little bit of trouble about like who paid for the studies, but look, at the end of the day, we're just talking social experiments here. So for me, what he said is there's about 5% of the population that are sociopaths. There's about 5% of the population, again, give or take, that are morally incorruptible. And that might be you, dude, just to be totally frank. I think you are definitely a principled person from what I understand about you. You march to your own beat, but I'm not. I sometimes speed. I sometimes have been a little loosey-goosey on, I won't say the I or something S. I know that I will decide. There was a joke in Baltimore when I lived there. I would never pay the meter because I had done the math that I only got caught 1 out of every 3 times. So I could leave my car wherever I want it, anxiety-free, Brandon, for $7 a trip. Like imagine, everybody's running around. I got to get changed. I'm like, no, just leave it there and let them give you a ticket. You're only going to get one every 3 or 4 times. I get to park anxiety-free $7 a time I drop.
Oh, that's a good approach. I mean, it's just a math equation.
But my point in all this is that I think we sometimes have to be careful about the inputs. We've got to be careful about what we're around because our environment does shape a lot of us. It just does. It does until it doesn't. Our past shapes a lot of us. It does until it doesn't. And I think that's the opportunity for people, all of us, me included.
And I think this is a good segue because the last 49 minutes is really when it comes to the answer to these questions around who we are, organizational behavior, growing your company, growing your life, growing your family, growing your relationship, whatever, winning at sports, doing your hobby, whatever that is, it's really at the end of the day on you. It's
Yep.
not a structure. It's not this magic thing that's going to come down. It's you. You're the business. You're the person. You're the engine.
Right.
Your engine works different than other people's engine. There are some common things. We all have hearts. We all have lungs.
Right.
There's some basics here that if you abuse the rules apply.
Sure.
But then there's these nuanced things that if you don't get in touch, the real risk is if you don't do it, you will miss out. And that I'm saying that definitively. You will miss out. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. You may have a good life and never do it. The question is, could it be better? What did Jim Rohn say? I know that dates me before even Tony Robbins, right? But if you can do better, should you?
Right.
Should you? And that always struck me as, man, that's such a hard hitting statement. Like, Jesus, I really need to do something better today. I mean, with that, and your journey has been an interesting one, and you're very open and vulnerable, which I'm grateful for. And I know everybody who's ever heard you is as well. And everybody has grown coming out of those things.
Thanks.
You and I were talking about some recent, I called it therapy. You can correct me or change it or acknowledge it, but the psilocybin movement has come on. I have a friend who started a company in that space. I have read a lot about it. I know Hopkins and maybe two other research, or Stanford and one other place maybe has been granted permission. You have done some of this therapy. I was talking to Yvette, my wife, the other day, and she was with her friend actually in DC. And her friend said to her, "Oh, yeah, I microdose. I've been microdosing forever. Don't you microdose?" And Yvette was like, "Microdose what? Like, what are you talking about? I did acid back in college when I went to Grateful Dead concerts, and I always I don't anymore after 27 years, but I used to always be like, man, you've done acid like 7 times, Yvette. Like, are you okay? Maybe this is that a function of that work that you did back then." But the joke may be on me, Joe, because my wife is actually so self-actualized that she doesn't care what the Joneses are doing. She doesn't. Like, it's not that she doesn't care in a way that she doesn't care if someone gets hurt or anything. She does not concern herself solving any problem that is not hers and does not directly relate to her life and her people that she cares about. And she goes through life. And I've always admired that in this sense, like, why don't you ask more questions? She doesn't allow me to ask questions after 11. It was part of the reason I started podcasting again. Get to ask all these questions, right? And Yvette gets a better life with me. But I mean, I'm half joking, but not really. And I'm like, why? Like, you did that whole thing. Were you curious at all why they did it? Like, did you ask that question? And to this day, I still am like, Jesus, woman. She's like, no. Like, why does it matter? And it's like, well, I guess, like, how do you, I guess I just be curious. It doesn't affect me. It's not going to matter. I'm not going to change it. Let's focus on what we're doing. Have you ever seen that movie Middlemen, Joe? Have you ever seen that?
No.
Oh my God. This is how the internet started. It was for listeners who are younger or have young kids. I'm not saying I recommend it, but I do recommend it because the internet was really started besides the government in the porn industry, and the porn industry is who invented billing system. And Middlemen is a story with Luke Wilson in it, loosely based on the truth of a company called 24/7 Billing that still exists to this day. But one of the things Luke Wilson says in that movie is that really kept them always on track and changed conversations was, Joe, let's focus on why we're here.
Right.
And it instantly gets people back to center, or I don't know center, but back to where you both should be focused on. So that's why I was like, let's focus on while we're here. There's a long way of saying that this whole psilocybin thing may, going back to your description of how old ways and old beliefs continue on because it's hard to change those and actually takes a lot of cognitive energy to change your opinion on things. But there's a lot of science coming out that says, hey, look, it's going to be hard to ignore the results that we're seeing. And whether we're seeing them because of the therapy or the drug, or it's a placebo effect, actually doesn't matter. And if you think you're doing something cutting edge and new and it gives you this feeling or these insights, who cares?
Right.
So maybe you could share that as like, I'm giving you a break too, so you could drink something. Uh, give some insight on your experience because it's interesting. And what struck me, and I'll let you go with it, is something you said to me the other day when we were catching up, which was, and I'm pretty definitive in my statements sometimes. I'm like, I know how I figure out new ideas. I know how I have a method, right? I lift weights and I ride bikes at an extreme, meaning I'm putting myself in a physical state that I literally cannot think of anything else but that moment, in that moment, with nothing else to think about, either because my heart rate's at 187 beats a minute, or I'm the other day going down a hill at 45 miles an hour, scared to death that this is 45 miles an hour and I'm still accelerating and like the car is keeping up with me. There is no choice but to be in that moment. Now, that can be dangerous. I don't take it to those extremes. It can be, but and then you said to me, well, what if you did this? And you said, I don't even think you've had your best ideas yet. And I really, it was like sort of a whammy statement you gave me. And I thought about that on a bike ride. And I was like, well, what could that open up? So with that, like, what has it opened up for you, and what have you seen based on, our conversation here, which you really laid out? Like, you struggle with these things, and you know, I'm not saying you seem happier. I don't ever remember you not happy, but you seem more relaxed, let's say.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have some time on this one, as you can imagine. There's a bunch of different ways I could approach this. I'm just going to riff and see where we land here. But I'll start backwards, which is I am the most whole I have ever been. And I'm annoyed when I hear people say that sometimes, or at least I was. And now I have a little bit of a different way that I travel, that I think about things, that I show up at the house with my lady, that I have a relationship with her and the kids. I mean, I start there, which is, every single day, no bullshit, no cliche is like heaven on earth for me. I finally figured out how to stop trying for love. And I'll get to that one here in a second, but I think rolling the tape back a little bit, like if we just zoom out, all of us, which is everybody drinks for the most part, alcohol, wine, champagne, beer, and we don't think 2 seconds of it. And what we're going to end up finding out, sort of like if the sugar is our generation's tobacco, right? Everybody's okay with like giving kids candy and cake at birthday parties. And we know it's sort of like a cocaine hit, but we have not adjusted. We have not gotten the update, the software update. And so we're just continuing to run the play on sugar. On alcohol, we know it's not great for you, right? We just know. There's this debate between alcohol and cannabis, and like it's like, yeah, cannabis has been illegal, since the 30s because the guy who had the paper mill didn't like hemp as a competitor and figured out how to make it illegal, right? And there was a lot of racism involved in that whole thing too, which is again like we don't know the history. And then I'll jump into the psychedelic world, which is there's to me psychedelics and then psychedelic therapy. So we'll save the last one here for a second. Psychedelics, classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin. These two in particular, as classic psychedelics from about the 50s all the way up to about the 70s when Nixon was in office, were being studied at all the major universities. So this isn't an opinion. This is just a Google it and you'll see. Anxiety, depression, cessation of smoking and alcohol had profound effects. The CIA loved it because it was a bit of a truth serum. It basically got whatever the neurotic piece of us out of the way. Okay. And it helped us stop singing someone else's song, but to sing our own truth is sort of my view of it. And at the time, we were sending young men off to fight in a war. And it was obviously in the moment, it seemed unpatriotic to not want to go to the war. And all these rallies and these protests, like the way we view it today, are they were hippies. They were like freebirding it and they loved like whatever. But at the end of the day, when we look back, the Vietnam War probably wasn't the best decision we've ever made as a country. And it's funny how history sometimes gives us that perspective. But those in power, back to the pyramid and the shape, were running the play. And so they made these things illegal. They put them on the Schedule 1 part of a bill that made these things, illegal. And so then we grew up with Nancy Reagan and Just Say No to Drugs and the War on Drugs and DARE. Right? I remember all these things. And so now we're all of a sudden asking people to rethink tripping or taking a journey or taking these things to not go to a rave or a concert. And again, to each his own. But what has happened over the last 20 years, to your point, in the psychedelic therapy world, which, there's an organization run by Rick Doblin called MAPS. And they've been studying this for decades. And then you pick up Roland Griffin at Hopkins, Stanford, NYU, Imperial College of London. They've come back over the last 10 or so years. And if you've not checked out a book by a gentleman, his name is Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, came out about 5 years ago, really documenting all of this. And so let's just start with the first use case, which is, soldiers with the worst forms of PTSD. And PTSD is something that we're all starting to learn a little bit more about, because all the things that you want to spend the first 46 minutes of this conversation on, in some ways, are traumas. They're mini or major missed expectations. You touch the stove, it was hot. You never want to touch the stove again. I had a conversation with my dad once and he yelled at me. I never want to do that again. Right? We avoid and avert the adversity. There we are again. And what's funny about trauma is there are trauma that you remember, and then there's trauma you don't remember. Like there are these major moments that you might have had in your life growing up where you fell off your bike, or you almost got in a car accident, or you did those things, and they have an impact on the brain. They create a sort of a new pathway that tell the brain, hey, don't get eaten by the bear today. Don't avoid the threat. So again, that's sort of the trauma piece. Gabor Mate, an amazing doctor, talks about addiction, right? And what we know about addiction is that we thought it was willpower. Now, I just lost my brother 2.5 months ago. He struggled a lot with all of these things that we're talking about here today. And I will tell you, as someone who grew up from 13 to 23 doing almost every drug on the planet and, had a little bit of a tough run with a couple of them, willpower is definitely important conversation. Personal responsibility is definitely an important conversation. But when you look at Alcoholics Anonymous, when you look at the way that they've helped so many people, get rid of their shame, come clean, open up, build community, rebuild a life, that process in a lot of ways you'll see in the classic psychedelic therapy, which is eye shades, music, settled environment, professional facilitator or therapist there to help you through your trauma. And to give everybody this statistic, 387 or so soldiers with the worst forms of PTSD, untreatable, have gone through, this psychedelic therapy using psilocybin, using MDMA, and 70 some percent, 72, I think it was, experience zero symptoms after 2 sessions. So we have 17 soldiers killing themselves every single day. One use case of psychedelic therapy is to deal with trauma. And we could help soldiers that are taking their lives because they were in the worst forms of the worst environments, coming back here, trying to re-enter the world. How do you make sense of that? It's not just talk therapy. Oh, that's a part of it. It's not just, get your body in shape. That's a part of it, not just get your financial life in shape. That's a part of it. But at the end of the day, like, you cannot, if I've got mud on my face, wiping it off on the camera is not going to do jack. And that's what we're doing, is we're trying to change the external environment to change the internal environment. So the first use case is really around trauma. Quickly, another use case, not quickly, but the other sort of predominant piece is what you're talking about, which is enlightenment, creativity, unlocks of new ideas. Steve Jobs, Sting, these are all folks that have gone on record to talk about how these things have helped them. The Beatles created the song Imagine after spending time in India and meditating and then doing LSD. And when you think about pure original thought, I think what's so interesting about art and music specifically is that it when you hear it, it's original, because you go, whoa, like the song by the Beatles, Imagine. You don't have to love the song, but when you hear it, you don't go, oh, just like another song I've heard before. No. And most artists will say the same thing, going all the way back to Da Vinci. Just they get a little woo in you. They got out of the way, and it kind of came through. Like when an idea hits you on a bike or you're in a shower, my question is, where do those things come from? And I've got some, possible theories on it. But the two use cases of psychedelic therapy: trauma, healing, becoming whole. And I can give you a little bit more about my journey there. And second, enlightenment, new ideas, lateral thinking, innovation, creativity, maybe coming up with some of the best that you've ever done. Remember, Einstein didn't do the relativity thing, I think, until his 30s and 40s. So like most of us get going between, like, they call it the midlife crisis. Maybe it's the midlife chrysalis, and I'm stealing that from a guy named Chick Conley. He's like, it gets a bad rap when you're in the middle of this whole thing. Like, this is prime time, baby. Like, and again, it's not about you building an empire, but maybe you get something for yourself. Maybe you get something for your lady. Maybe you get something for someone in your family. Maybe again, I don't know what it is, dude. You've got a book coming out, right? Maybe the next book gets inspired in a different way. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, you go run off and, this should be done. Here's all the qualifiers. Please don't do this at home in your basement. Don't get this from a friend. Don't do this by yourself. Do your own homework. Do your own reading. Not everybody should do this all the time. There's, definitely, this is not a magic bullet. It doesn't fix everything. But just as a starter, I'm excited that people have an additional option or two to think about how they become more whole and more healed. And on the other end, maybe higher performing, more innovative, more creative, like more accretive to the whole thing that we're doing here. So how's that for
What does more whole mean? Because you started with, I've never been more whole.
Yeah.
I mean,
so everybody's got a story, and mine, my parents had me when I was 20 and 21. They met hitchhiking. My mom was an aspiring actress. My dad, his mother married 5 times, twice to the same guy, Mechlinski. That's how I got the name. They divorced young. I grew up on people's couches. I went to 5 schools in 5 years. I went to the school that I told you about. I went to 23 funerals by the time I was 23. When my mom died, it was a big deal when I was 23. And I was her caretaker. And the way that she died was a little on my watch. I could have prevented it. I didn't. I was up in New York, and I was doing a big speaking gig at 23, and I left her in the hospital. She was in that hospital, by the way, all 4 years while I was in Hopkins. She didn't leave once. 2 pancreas transplants, 2 kidney transplants. She was blind, and she had a broken hip. She was in a wheelchair. And I was a kid just trying to figure it out. And, I didn't answer a phone call is essentially what it came down to. Like the one time I didn't answer. Then she called again, and I was just like, I can't keep doing this. She basically snuck out of the hospital when she wasn't supposed to, and they let her out when they weren't supposed to. And for like one day, I decided to pick me. I was not like the magnanimous son, the honorable guy, the stop everything and rush. Just like I had done that play for 20 some years. So of course, the fucking time I didn't, I come back to Baltimore, please call my dad's house, and they tell me that they found her dead. And I went and helped them put her in a bag, and I saw how she passed in her apartment. It was not kind. And after all the things I had lived through, that was like the way I started my career. 90 days later, we started the company. And I went to Tony Robbins. I went to Landmark. I went to every self-help course. I did all the books that you talked about. I read almost 1,000 of them. I tried talk therapy. I tried, Brandon, I tried a lot of things. I gave $1 million before I made $1 million to Baltimore City, just in trying to play a part. Like back to Maslow talked about self-actualization. First, he never said it was a pyramid. He never said it was ascension. Interesting. And his journal when he passed talked about another aspect, which was about purpose and impact and legacy and being a good ancestor. So I, intuitively felt that. So I was like, how do I play a part? And when you and I met, I was a go, 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 thinking that in some ways there was the guilt of I made it out. Let me do enough good to give back. In some ways it was, let me get to a financial point of freedom, but cleanly, not on the backs of others, not creating harm for others. And then the other side is like, keep trying things because it'll help me run a marathon without training, climb Kilimanjaro, jump out of a plane with nobody, like all of these sort of adventure, thrill seeking, and nothing made me feel different inside is the best way I can describe it. And I had been looking at what they were doing in this part of the world and got a little curious and did a lot of homework, a lot of reading for about a year, and got to the place that we're talking to now, which is, what's the right environment, the right access point, way before this was something that you could talk about publicly. And did a few sessions and immediately felt, Brandon, felt love, felt it back, felt like I could feel it. And I was a guy who like loved on people. I mean, you knew me. I wasn't like a non-emotional dude. All I can
No,
tell you is that
I called you the Tony Robbins of the Mid Atlantic. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, you were that, you had that much energy and that much output.
right.
I mean, I'm using the word output, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, to other people.
and still do.
No, you do. I'm not
But
suggesting you don't. Yes.
and I didn't. No, I wasn't meaning to correct you. But I want, if I want this to be helpful story for people, is I want them to hear that I had accomplished a New York Times bestselling book. We were the #1 book in the world for 3 days. I beat 50 Shades of Grey. I had a 400 on my verbal on my SAT, and I pulled this thing off. I got involved in investing in a VC firm. I met Richard Branson and Tony Hsieh and all of these interesting people. And it didn't change. Had kids, didn't change. Got married to the best person I've ever met, didn't change. Couldn't feel it. I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And it got a little low because I was like winning, but wasn't feeling it. And so all I can share with you is that after going through several experiences, what it helped me do is imagine if we had like a continuum of our eyes see in the red-green spectrum, right? The, Roy GB thingy. So we see in that spectrum, snakes see in a certain spectrum, other animals see in a different spectrum. But imagine taking that analogy and whatever your emotional bandwidth is. So mine was like, let's say here, it did this. It gave me more feeling. Now, not all good. Also the things I had avoided, like avoiding the guilt of my mom, like avoid feeling the shame of not being there. I'm the guy who's always there. I'm like the hospital friend. I'm the guy that you want when it's hard. And it's because how I grew up with her, taking care of her, and she took care of me. She was amazing. But that was hard. And, and it's something that I have forgiven myself for. So, I thought like you could just say, I could write it down. I would do the Julia Cameron, the artist way. I would write. I've got fucking 100 journals. I feel like that I'm trying to do like whatever it would take to incant myself out of this spell. And I finally, this is going to sound so stupid simple, but I basically sat and, was able to share my story, my real story, the whole thing, like not holding anything back, all the really hard stuff that I went through as a kid with therapists and my lady and other like core friends. And, their eyes were like, oh, this is a lot, right? Not like worse than I've ever heard. Not like I've got this is not the trauma Olympics. I didn't win a gold medal, but I've got my own version of a story. that I just didn't want to put on anyone else. And that hiding from, not willing to expose, is a bit of what shame can do and what undealt with trauma can do. So when you ask the question of how do I feel more whole, I feel more, the bandwidth has increased and decreased. So I have a greater spectrum of feeling, number one. Number two, that I love that book, Mark Manson, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And I love, like, I give a lot of fucks, and I still do. I'm not perfect. I'm definitely not like fixed, but the amount of fucks I give now are a lot less. And, there's some more there, but I think from just a healing perspective, again, it wasn't just psychedelic therapy. There was all of these other things that have been layered on top. So I think it's important as people do this, conversation, is that we attribute the right things or pattern, so that it's not like, well, I did this thing once and it fixed me because I went down to a jungle in Amazon and I took some ayahuasca. And it's like, cool, whatever floats your boat, sister, brother, whatever it is. But I think ultimately that was something that's been helpful for me on the healing and whole side of the equation.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that story, and I think it has definitely opened the door for not you're not the only person who I've heard do that. And to be quite frank, they've been doing this in the valley for a really long time here. And it's one of the reasons I moved to Silicon Valley, quite frankly, Joe, is because growing up as an East Coast person, there's so many rules. I always call it the original 13 colonies. And it's not that I was talking to my mom about this. I was like, man, I just can't stand it sometimes. Just even seeing old friends on Facebook or something, because there's so much more. And I know that. And she's like, yeah, but you, having seen both sides, you actually are, you have this superpower now, because there's good in each one. And I thought about that, and I was like, yeah, I still think you should open the door for a woman, and for women listening who are like that chauvinistic, like, okay, man, like that's just how I grew up. If I had a box and a woman opened the door for me, I'd be grateful for that too. I mean, it's not this male chauvinistic role type thing, but I think that, exposing yourself to new ideas and these things, it really changes your perspective. And I think it's really hard. And if something like this can do it, and like, I was laughing when you said, because I hear a lot of people, they're going to Mexico and doing this ayahuasca thing and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, hey, look, man, if that's what it takes, then do it. But understand, and I think this is an important point that you made that can't be, this is not, I think that's the reason why when you first told me, in all honesty, reflecting on it, I was like, whatever. Like, the reason is because it still takes work. I question, had you not done the 52 journals that are on your shelf, the talk therapy, Kilimanjaro, jumping out of planes, like, had you not had that, would that have done it? Or would that have done it and then you kicked off those things? And for some people, it may be like that, PTSD and war and things, trauma is like things that most of us just aren't going to know or think about. That one thing could bring them closer, and that it doesn't mean they're finished. It means that closer is a big deal when you're at the bottom. I mean, but I think it's going to take, it takes work, and it's not one and done. You mentioned, and I don't know how many times you've done it, but you probably have to do maintenance doses of this. Like, you're so old with decades of habits and neural pathways and just general regular things that you do, that you're going to have to bump yourself back every once in a while. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know what that's like, but I know I have really good friends who are in it. And I'm not saying it's the answer, because I think some people, I tend to believe what you explained earlier, which is just effing stop.
Yeah.
Now that's hard, but just stop. I know how hard it is not to eat pretzels every day. Like, and I try not to, but just stop. And when I do make that decision and own it, it's not actually as hard. It's actually easier, because the incremental is painful. But that's all to say that I think you would agree. You're going to have to work at your thing, but this is bringing something back that really can spark a big change. And if you're really low or you've just not done what haven't been doing well a decade in your life, and you just get that much better in 1 or 2 or 3 sessions, that's exponential change for you.
Well, and give yourself a little bit of credit here. I referenced a gentleman by the name of Gabor Mate, who, if you've not checked out his work, he's got a great TEDx talk on. He had a classical music addiction, and everybody goes, "Oh, give me a fucking break!" Like, hold on. He will talk about the original sin, so to speak, of most of us as children, were that we were to cry until no one came. We were to sleep away from our parents. Now, before we get in the philosophical part about sovereignty and self independence, I'm not suggesting everything he said is spot on, but what I am saying is that, the longest longitudinal study at Harvard about what a happy life looks like, or when we think about the book, The Five Regrets of Dying, right, which is a great book by a palliative care nurse in Australia. She interviewed 1,400 people at the end of their life, summarized all of their regrets, and you'll like not be shocked to hear. And I think in a lot of respects, what you get from me and that insatiable energy is when you walk and you see 23 people die by the time you're 23, it changes a little bit of your time calculus on like, well, how much time do we have? We're hurling through the universe here on a rock. We have no fucking idea where we're going, right? I mean, none. We have no idea, really. We just don't. I mean, I'm pretty up on the astrophysics and the where we're going and that, but like, we really don't know. Okay. Every time we see the Earth spin around that's not the way it's a bullet. We're going around. We're kind of catching the sun. It's not like we're just kind of hanging around like a top spinning around a quarter. It's like it's a very different way to think about this. And I think his point is that a missed expectation. I expected my mom or dad to come. That creates a mini trauma. So yes, the continuum of people who've been, physically, emotionally abused in violent situations, of course, that is a very different thing than a missed expectation. And going back to the way the brain works, neuroplasticity is the idea that your brain can create different patterns, different pathways off of different inputs, sensory and otherwise. And so when you start to kind of go down this path, Sam Harris does a great job of this, talking about how everything really is an illusion. When we think about the idea of a simulation, without getting too far down this pathway of, I'm not suggesting the whole reality is, but your brain, we just learned this 20 years ago, we wouldn't have said this. 20 years ago, we'd say your brain is taking in light, turning it into chemical, electrical impulses past the retina, going into the brain, creating this environment that you're taking it all in. Well, we actually learned that that's not the way it works. Actually, the way it works is the same way that AI, ChatGPT is doing it, which is there's a model, there's hierarchy, there's weight, and there's a precision error. And that's really the way the brain works. That's actually why ChatGPT feels like we're talking to someone, because it's the first time a computer, back to the Turing test, it's the first time that we feel like we're actually talking to a person. And it's a weird thing because they built it in the same way that the brain works. And I think what I would want people to hear out of this is not the science. You can go way down the rabbit hole and all this stuff. Your brain is operating from the past. That's it. So to break that pattern of pretzels, or in your case, getting back to where I was trying to drive a big fat compliment and acknowledgement, is like, Brandon, you're one of the smartest guys I've met in my 20 some years. And I mean that in a real genuine way. The first time I met you, I was instantly impressed. Your discipline is through the fucking roof. Your ability to see things before they happen, your stick-to-itiveness and the success that you've had in business, the way that you've shown up for me recently, they all check all the right boxes. And the fact that you started with I already know what I need to know about this psychedelic therapy. And even in the last week or so that we've been chatting recently, to just ever so slightly, like, not say I'm ready to do it, not even say I'm ever going to do it, but to open the door to a new update. That is leadership. Staying open. It doesn't mean you're going to do anything about it. But like, how many times do you have conversations with people, to your point, about willpower? It's like most people aren't even willing to put the chips down. You were willing to put the chips down in this conversation, is what I experienced. And what I think people ought to hear in this is that it's not about doing it. It's just about being mindful of an opinion about something you've never done. And it doesn't mean, like, as one of your hot tips, it doesn't mean don't have opinions about things. But for goodness sake, just acknowledge maybe chicken is and avocados are bad for me, but avocados are bad for you, but chicken's great for you. Like, that is the point. Who knows? And the book, by the way, that I'm writing is called Who Says? Like, that's the point. Like, who says? Any of this stuff matters. Who knows? So,
Yeah, and it was very, very kind of you. I don't, one of the things, Joe, that surprises me, I was talking to my mom the other day, and we were talking about, I've had 3 ACL reconstructions. I had my first one at 13. The rules of lacrosse of not hitting the guy in the face off was heavily impacted by my injury. I played at Cockeysville Lacrosse, which is an East Coast place that I saw a statistic the other day that has produced more All-American. The Cockeysville Lacrosse program has
yeah.
produced more All-Americans than any lacrosse program in the country ever. And I remember playing for that team, and we were being recruited for high school and college in 7th and 8th grade. Well, I got hit on a face off because it used to be allowed, and I tore my ACL. I was 13 years old. And I've had 2 more reconstructions since. I now don't have an ACL. The doctor said that it's just bone on bone, so it's actually stronger than an ACL apparently. And I think I lost all my feelings, so it doesn't really bother me. But anyway, we were talking about it, and I don't know what we were talking about. We were talking about life or something, and she said, we were talking about, I work with a sports psychologist. My mom luckily had a friend whose husband was a very well-known psychologist who'd worked with all the top people. He's from Baltimore, and he agreed to meet with me. And I met with him every single week for years, and it really changed it. But she said something to me, and I'm going to get to my point here, is that she said, you were on the couch after the second one, and I just felt like you were very down, and you were getting old, is what her words were. And she said, but I always admired you because you always came back. Like you always came back. And I can remember where these are pivotal moments. I'll probably remember this forever. And this was just a week or two ago. And I was standing up. I can remember where I was standing in the kitchen, and was looking out the window, and it hit me, Joe. I never knew quitting was an option. Now, I'm not saying that I'm some strong, crazy person here. I'm just saying, however my brain is wired, that is the first time. I'm 50s, so whatever, that's a long time ago. My second one was in high school. It's the first time that I ever knew it was an option. And I really thought about that for a while. Like, how much of life is just having a mindset that not getting through it, or it's just not an option for me. Like, failure just inherently isn't an option. And maybe I've been lucky with that, because I didn't get taught that. I don't know where it came from. I can't tell you. I'm clearly driven. And that goes back to, like, I don't want to go into my story, right? But a dyslexic kid growing up in a single family with the mom who, we didn't have a lot of money, and just wanting to win. Like, I went back at one point in my life, Joe, and looked at all the pictures that I'm in, even up until recently. And I am always in the middle, because I always want to make sure that I'm up front. Like, and it's just inherent in me, but not having that choice. And I think one of the things that, look, I struggled with a lot of things for a long time too, and everybody does. But I think the thing that you said several times that is the key to this, and if you use psilocybin therapy to do it, do it. If you need a group to do it, do it. If you need to journal every day, do it. If you need a combination of these things and you need to experiment, do it.
Right.
But it's all. You said something earlier. Charlie Munger says, if you want to see why someone does it, just understand the incentive structure. And if you want someone to do it, just design the incentive structure. Like, I learned this from psychology years and years ago. This isn't magic. Humans are predictable animals. And what it really comes down to in life is your expectations and these mini traumas, as you put it. I never thought about them as mini traumas. I thought about it as disappointment. But change your expectations. Check yourself.
Right.
Because if you expect nothing and then someone says, well, Brandon, well, that's really just, you're cynical. It's not. I'm not cynical. I am protecting myself to being open about the future, right? And by not having an expectation that's made up, by the way, and I don't want to go down this because you and I know we said 2 hours and we're an hour and a half through this, but actually your entire reality is made up. And I can prove it because your optical nerve connects to the back of your eye, and your eye right now is filling that in with made up stuff.
100%.
With the only data it has, which is the past and a millisecond of current. In fact, I'll even screw with people's minds even more is think about, you brought this up, is music, Joe. So music is actually completely made up. You know why? Because you can only hear one note in 1 second at one moment in time. You have to remember the past, you have to listen to the future, and your brain is predicting the future. That's why you can always catch anything, not just music.
Right.
You can always see something different, but you only catch it after it happens. And that's why reaction times sometimes get you into trouble, because your brain has to correct itself.
Right.
So, I mean, I wrote a whole paper in college on this, and I thought I the truth is, Joe, my psychology professor, when my first paper, I go to Washington College, I write my first paper in psychology, and he gives me a D and says it's the worst. This is true. The worst writing he has ever seen in his entire life, and sends me to the writing lab. Now, let me give you some context. I'm an A student through high school. I'm National Honor Society. I graduate second in my class. I get A's in English. Oh, but let me mention that I did get an NCAA sports writing scholarship to go to school. But I'm the worst paper he's ever heard. So I basically say, you know what? This guy is crazy. I'm going to write this paper on some totally things I've thought about, like the cat isn't there when you're not there. You're not here. We're made up. I write this whole paper basically on that. And he says, I get an A+ and says it's the best paper he has ever seen in his entire life. And that lesson for me was what I wrote actually possibly true? That we do make it all up, which means that we make up our expectations, which means if we change our expectations, then we change our reality. And therein lies we accept what it is. And I think for me, that's, when you said some very nice things, which, I hope half of them are true. I just never known that there was not a choice, right? Like I tell people, like, go to Burning Man. I don't care if you are a far left, a far right, there's the wrong hand, whatever. I'm dyslexic for sure. But put yourself in uncomfortable positions that are not uncomfortable safety wise, but
Right.
uncomfortable for you, and watch what happens. And I think that's why when I reflected on that, I was like, man, I was really a jerk when I told Joe, like, fuck that thing. Like, I'm not doing that. Like, I got my thing. And then I was like, okay, well, you've been wrong. I know Yvette will want to replay that like 5 times, but maybe 10. What could I learn? I respect Joe. I've known Joe for 20 years. He's not a dumb guy. He's built a successful company. He did do a New York Times bestseller, and he's now got a cool software company. Like, what can I learn from that? And I think, that lesson actually came. People ask me what my number one business book is, Joe. Number one business book I've ever read, ever. And I don't claim to read as many as you, but I've read a lot. is Celestine Prophecies. And the one lesson is, what can I learn from this moment? Stop judging the moment. What can I learn? And as soon as you ask, what can I learn from this moment? A whole world emerges that you never imagined. And
Yeah.
that's my speech to your answer.
Well, it's a great book. I toss in Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning, right? The idea of, can you give a little bit of space between the stimulus and the response? Something happens, we have an immediate reaction. The longer that we think about it, right? Not just go Buddha and meditate for an hour, but really allow yourself to break the pattern of the past, to assess a different series of options. And I think the thing that you said that also might be interesting to think about, which is like, one of the things that happened for me as I did this therapy was I was starting to remember why I felt certain ways. Like you, I wrote a book called Grow Regardless. The idea being, I can fucking figure it out no matter what, right? I will, if I don't know it, I'll ask someone and I'll learn it. And if I don't have it, I will work until it happens, period. End of subject. And I'm like you. Like I didn't know exactly when, like what. Yeah, I grew up poor. Yeah, I didn't like it. I didn't like wearing the same clothes every day. I didn't like not having food. But being able to go back and travel mentally, emotionally, spiritually in a place that I could see the moment when those things happened, what it did is it provided more context for why. And that was interesting to me because that, I think, is the glasses in which you have on right now. And if I had them, I could say, well, mine are tainted. They have a filter on them as reality is coming in. It is going through this meaning making machine we call a brain. And I think, to your point, sometimes I'm aware that I'm on autopilot and I got to stop. Go, whoa, I, I am making this up. I can make a different option. But if we're being honest, you don't tell yourself to breathe right now. You don't tell yourself to make your heart beat. So we have a parasympathetic nervous system that is essentially at work. Dan and Chip Heath wrote a book called Change. And the whole idea was, we're the elephant, right? And the rider. Like, it's like, who's in charge, the conscious or the subconscious? And it's like, that's interesting. Maybe both, right? There's a lot that I think you're teasing on that would be helpful for people just to play a thought experiment around, like, how awake and alive are you to not only the decisions that you're making, but also why? Because that sometimes the why is not about like, oh, well, this happened when I was there, but you might be able to sort of see, what have I been avoiding? Not you. I'm just saying, for me, like, what it was helpful is, like, I got a chance to experience what it looked like to watch me grow up through my mother's eyes. That was one experience. Very powerful, because I definitely held a little bit of a grudge against, like, her life decisions, how hard it was. I was a little judgy wudgy was a bear about it, even though I loved her. And I think she's, one of the most amazing people that, she gave birth to me. And there was a complicated relationship. I think people are funny, and we're a lot more complicated than we give ourselves credit for at times. And I think that's the part where, whether it's a dynamic between you and your lady, or me and my kids, or me and my partners, or whomever, the opportunity to make it more and better or less, depending on what the problems are, I think is the experiment. That's the experiment. And to your point, it's just try things. It doesn't have to be this hairy, weird thing that we're talking about. It could be cold plunging, sauna, meditating, working out, walking. I got out of Baltimore. We left my hometown 42 years. I was like, am I going to be here forever? Or what are we doing? Like, did I choose to stay here? Or should I think of, like, what you did? Like, I haven't done the big leap, 3,000 miles, but you're inspiring me to think about it, because I do know that when I look at the Pacific, she makes me smile. I do know it brings out a different level of energy from me. And I think that's, at the end of the day, all of us just have an opportunity to live this life however we want, and to just know at the very last moments, we're likely going to run the script that woman talked about in 5 Regrets of Dying, which is, I wish I lived a life on my terms. I wish I hadn't worked so much. I wish I had loved on people more. I wish I had spent more time with friends. And I always forget the fifth one. So read the book if you haven't, folks, and check
Yeah,
it out.
there's a good what do they call that? Unsatisfied loop or empty open loop. uh, to read the book. Well, listen, you've been really generous with opening up, and I think this is a great episode. I do have a question. I do have at the end. We all know I ask
Yeah.
3 HPTs, and I warned you that. But before, I'm going to throw you a curveball and ask you what you think the title of this episode should be.
What is the title of this episode? Um, I could go two different ways. I'll give you a quick off the hip one is you're the star, the producer, the director of the play. And don't forget that. You're not only guiding it, you're not only directing it, but you're in it. And as you think about playing all three of those roles, just read, maybe something around that. Is that you're the actor, the director, and the producer. I have lived by a mantra my whole life of finding a way. And I think that's the invitation for anyone listening to this, which is like, if I can do it, you can do it. And I think your story is also inspirational, which is like, how does a kid from Cockeysville, and I know there's something in the water up there for sure, because, the kids that come out of there playing lax definitely have a different level of just engagement with that sport. But I think being able to hear people find a way is the inspiration that we love watching a Disney movie, or we love watching Good Will Hunting, or all these like things that make us go, just when I thought I couldn't go anymore, find the energy to finish the ride, find like, to your point, failure is not an option. And I think it's a really beautiful way to put it. So I don't know. Those are
Well,
the
thank you. I
best
just
I got.
wanted to. I didn't want to ask ChatGPT. I always try to title these right afterwards, and then I re-listen to them, and then Gia, our operations director, is always mad at me because I can't come up with the titles. And I'm like, I need to be in the moment to come up with the titles. So figured I'd ask you. But wrapping up here, you get to give 3 pieces of advice. I did trap you in the beginning and ask you for one business advice. But if you only give 3 pieces of advice for life, business, whatever they are, you're giving 3 pieces of advice to your kids. What do you say?
So I think the first we hit, but I would say it more plainly, which is be mindful of all these opinions you have about things you've never tried. I think we get in a lot of trouble there. And I think you find a lot of time people debating things that they know nothing about, or they haven't really dug in. Most people stop using the word I did research. You did homework. You read some things. Research is setting up experiments and like actually doing rigor and understanding the scientific method and kind of going through and playing a red team, blue team, and not caring about, to your point, the answer, but caring about the process of figuring out what is the next best answer. So I think the first pieces I would say is be really mindful about having opinions on things that you haven't tried anything on. Number one. Number two, when's the last time you had a software update? So I really think that when you say we can't teach an old dog new tricks, or high school, college were the best days of my life, you're negating or forgetting that it was because you were assimilating new information and perspectives. And I think, we all get a chance to go 0-0 tomorrow on the scoreboard. Like, what's tomorrow going to be? And are you going to give people the benefit of the doubt? So for 10 seconds as a digression, do you know what we should really do in this country immediately? Is kill Thanksgiving. It's a terrible holiday. It didn't go down that way. I can assure you they weren't that excited about giving us the land for, I think it was $20 some, because they didn't understand the concept of ownership. Interesting, for another episode for us to dig into. Like, we're not taking any of this with us. Talk about making things up. Nothing is coming with you. So we are fighting over a lot of things that we think we're taking with us. But the idea that we're not willing to accept or just start over with new information, and not that the recency effect should be the bias, which is like, oh well, whatever I said or read last, that's the new version. No. It's our role to integrate that information and that perspective into something different. And so I think when we talked, just about an hour ago about psychedelic therapy, integration practice is a really important thing. It's not like a one-off. It's something that you do on an ongoing basis. So I think, the idea of just be careful of when's the last time you had a software update. Our phones, again, do it 13 to 15 times a year. I think setting one New Year's resolution once a year is a little fucking lame at this point. I think you should be doing it a little bit more often. And so try that out. And the last thing I would say is find your own song, your way. When you think about Sinatra, he said it my way, right? We get one quick trip. We're not going to be here long. We're going to inevitably say, and I can see it now, we've got kids that are 12 and 10. A buddy of mine wrote this book called Family Board Meeting, which is about the 18 summers you get with your kids. To hear that, 18 summers. Tim Urban has a great blog, Wait But Why. He talks about the idea of doing reverse math. Like if you and I are going to live until we're, let's call it 90 or 100 if we're lucky, how many more times do we get a chance to see each other? How many more times do we get a chance? And so I think playing the math on the reverse, that you get one trip here, you got to make it count. You got to decide what will make it worth it to you, is the way I would think about wanting to hear this if it were me 5 years ago.
I think it's great advice. I always used to count how many migrations I would get of striped bass so I could catch more. And it always scared the crap out of me. It just dawned on me. We did not talk about your new software company, and we do need to. Can you just give the elevator pitch? Because I know that you have an elevator pitch after last week.
Well, thank you. Thanks to you. And look, I've been a consultant for my entire career. I've read a few books on the topic. I spend a lot of time with smart people who've done some really big, major, massive billion-dollar organizations. And in less than 30 minutes, you gave me the framework, the feedback, and really some good fire in the belly to figure out like how to get to the next version of this. So for people who have not checked out your book yet, they should. I think you definitely have this unique ability to help people cut to the fucking chase, which I have not done today in our conversation. So,
I think you did.
So real quick, we have been helping organizations change and grow despite and regardless of their circumstances. And one of the hardest things in our industry is to figure out how do you manage and measure that. And so what we have built is a platform that helps get your entire organization on the same page without scheduling more meetings. And so if you remember that moment when someone introduced to you Slack and you said, why do I need another place to email or text people? And then all of a sudden you were like, holy shit, there's a better way to collaborate asynchronously. Asynchronously, a big word that just means on your own time. So each week, our executive leaders are basically saying, hey, Brandon White has got a great way of thinking about hard, adverse, tough situations. In my conversation with him, he gave me this notion that failure is not an option. And I think all of our A's, B's, and C's should hear this story. So imagine every week having a digital podium to share the best of the best across the organization, where it only took your team less than 10 minutes each week to get on. And we've got, a lot of really great case studies that are showing that we're giving people, and leaders specifically, you said the golden rule, treat people how you want to be treated. I'd give you one other way to think about it. It's the platinum rule. Treat them how they want to be treated. So who needs a hug this week and who needs a lesson? Who needs you to show up in a different way? And when we're thinking about hybrid work, it's hard. It's like I don't see people anymore. I don't hear them. I can't feel them in the same way. This platform allows for a digital home in a little bit of a different way. It's called Latch. And you can check us out, shiftthework.com, and you'll see where to go and check all that out. So thanks for
we will put that in the show notes. And for listeners, his elevator pitch is we eliminate meetings.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So
I'm learning, Brandon. I will get there. I promise.
No, I just want to. I want that is in essence. I will tell you that I am saying that because Joe walked me through the platform. We are going to roll it out for one of the companies that I have. I think it's super simple and easy and effective. I am excited about getting on it because we're hiring like 2 people a week right now. So this sort of platform I think is really important. And you changed my mind on that. I think, I think our conversation changed my mind. Originally, I was like, oh, another platform. Then I started thinking about it and I'm like, oh, Well, that makes sense. So check it out. We'll put it in the show notes. Joe, man, this has been awesome. Thanks so much. It's actually just as good catching up on here and talking about this stuff than it was last week. So I'm really grateful for that.
Hey man, thanks for having me. Excellent experience on my end, and I'm excited to share this out with our group too. And just appreciate what you're doing, man. Which is really, I think, not giving people a hand out, but a hand up. So thanks.
Bye, everyone. Stay on for a second.
Yep.